The briefing room at Naval Special Warfare Command fell silent when Captain Marcus Reaper Valdez posed the question that would change everything. 23 of the Navy's most elite operators sat in rigid attention, their weathered faces illuminated by the pale glow of tactical displays showing satellite imagery of a compound deep in hostile territory. The mission parameters were brutal. Extract a captured CIA asset before dawn, navigate through contested airspace, and do it with zero margin for error. The problem wasn't the enemy. It was finding someone qualified to fly them through a gauntlet of surface-to-air missiles and enemy fighters in the dead of night. Gentlemen, Valdez's voice carried the weight of a man who'd seen too many good soldiers come home in boxes. We need a pilot who can thread the needle through SAM sights, evade radar, and land a bird in a hot LZ smaller than a basketball court. This isn't a training exercise. This is life or death. His steel-gray eyes swept the room, searching faces that had conquered mountains, cleared buildings, and faced death without flinching, but piloting a stealth helicopter through enemy territory. That required a different kind of courage, a precision that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. The SEALs shifted uncomfortably. These were men who prided themselves on being prepared for anything, but the specialized skills required for this extraction were beyond even their extensive training. Valdez continued, his words cutting through the tension like a blade. I need someone who's flown combat missions in contested airspace, someone who knows what it means to have missiles locked onto their six and still complete the mission. The room remained eerily quiet. Outside, the California sun was setting over Coronado Beach, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson, colors that reminded everyone present of the fires they'd walked through in distant lands. The mission clock was ticking. Intelligence suggested their window of opportunity would close within 18 hours. After that, the asset would likely be moved to a more secure location, or worse, executed. That's when she stood up. Captain Nix, Phantom, Castellanos rose from her seat in the back corner with fluid, economical movement. At 5'6" with raven black hair pulled into a regulation bun, she didn't look like the stereotypical image of a combat pilot. Her uniform bore the wings of a naval aviator, but more importantly, it carried ribbons that told stories most of the men in that room couldn't fathom. The Silver Star, the Distinguished Flying Cross, campaign medals from Iraq, Afghanistan, and classified operations that didn't officially exist. Every eye in the room turned toward her. Some of the SEALs exchanged skeptical glances. They'd seen desk pilots before, officers who wore the uniform but had never truly been tested in the crucible of combat. They didn't know her story yet. They didn't know about the night she'd flown a damaged MH-60M Black Hawk through a sandstorm with hydraulic failure, navigating by instruments alone while insurgent tracers lit up the darkness around her. They didn't know about the 17 Special Operations soldiers who owed their lives to her steady hands and unbreakable nerve. Valdez studied her for a long moment, recognition dawning in his eyes. He'd heard whispers about Phantom, stories that seemed too incredible to be true. A pilot who could make aircraft dance through the sky like deadly ballet, who could land in spaces that shouldn't be landable, who had never lost a passenger in over 40 combat missions. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. In the dim glow of the tactical displays, Lieutenant Commander Jake Bulldog Morrison couldn't hide his smirk. He'd been in special operations for 8 years, had worked with pilots from every branch of the military, and had developed opinions about who could handle the pressure and who couldn't. In his experience, the best combat pilots were born from a specific mold: aggressive, borderline reckless, usually male, and always loud about their capabilities. The quiet woman standing in the corner didn't fit his mental profile of a warrior aviator. "Ma'am," Morrison's voice carried a subtle undertone of condescension wrapped in military politeness. "With respect, this isn't a training flight or a transport mission. We're talking about penetrating sophisticated air defenses, possibly engaging enemy aircraft, and executing precision maneuvers under extreme duress. This is combat flying at its most demanding level. He gestured toward the tactical display showing the maze of surface-to-air missile sites surrounding their target. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, and we all come home in body bags. Several other SEALs nodded in agreement. Master Chief Petty Officer Rick Sledge Patterson, whose arms were covered in tattoos commemorating fallen brothers, shifted forward in his chair. His weathered face, marked by shrapnel scars from an IED blast in Ramadi, reflected years of hard-earned skepticism. "No offense intended, Captain, but we've worked with a lot of pilots. The ones who can handle this kind of heat, they usually make themselves known pretty quickly. They tell war stories, talk about their close calls, let you know what they've accomplished." His eyes narrowed slightly. "You've been sitting there quiet as a church mouse for the entire briefing." The room's atmosphere grew thick with unspoken tension. These men had learned to rely on bravado and confidence as indicators of competence. In their world, the loudest voice often belonged to the most experienced operator. Phantom's silence, rather than conveying mysterious competence, registered as uncertainty to warriors who measured courage in decibels. Staff Sergeant Miguel Viper Rodriguez, a sniper with 37 confirmed kills, leaned back in his chair with barely concealed disdain. His dark eyes reflected the harsh pragmatism of someone who had seen what happened when inexperienced personnel were thrust into high-stakes situations. "Look, lady, I don't care what ribbons you've got or what desk you're flying from these days. This mission requires someone who's been shot at, someone who's felt the heat of enemy fire, someone who knows what it's like to have their aircraft systems failing while people are depending on them to stay alive." The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Other team members began muttering among themselves, their voices creating a low buzz of discontent that filled the briefing room. They weren't being intentionally cruel, they were being practical. In their minds, the lives of their teammates hung in the balance, and they couldn't afford to risk those lives on someone they perceived as unproven. Phantom remained perfectly still throughout the growing chorus of doubt. Her dark eyes, calm as deep water, showed no reaction to their skepticism. She didn't fidget, didn't defend herself, didn't offer explanations or credentials. Her silence was so complete it began to feel almost supernatural, as if she existed in a different dimension from the increasingly agitated voices around her. Captain Valdez watched this exchange with growing fascination. He recognized something in Phantom's stillness, the same quality he'd observed in apex predators moments before they struck. Her composure wasn't uncertainty, it was the calm that comes from absolute confidence in one's abilities. The mission clock continued its relentless countdown, and somewhere in hostile territory, a CIA asset was running out of time. Morrison pressed his advantage, his voice growing more animated as he sensed support from his teammates. "Ma'am, what I'm trying to say is that this mission requires someone with a proven track record in high-threat environments. We need a pilot who's been tested under fire, who's proven they can make split-second decisions when lives are on the line." He gestured broadly to encompass the room. Every man in this room has been in situations where one wrong move meant death, not just for himself, but for his brothers. That's the kind of pressure we're talking about. The other SEALs voiced their agreement more loudly now. Petty Officer First Class Danny Chaos McKenzie, whose red hair and freckled face made him look younger than his 28 years, spoke up from the front row. "Look, no disrespect, but we've all seen what happens when people freeze up under pressure. In our line of work, hesitation kills. If you've never been in that situation before, if you've never felt that kind of adrenaline dump when everything goes sideways and people are shooting at you, how do we know you won't lock up when we need you most?" The sentiment rippled through the room like a wave. These were men who had earned their positions through years of brutal training, countless missions, and blood spilled in service to their country. They had lost friends to pilots who made critical errors under pressure. Their skepticism wasn't born from sexism or prejudice. It was born from experience with the deadly consequences of placing trust in the wrong hands. Phantom's expression remained as unchanging as stone. She stood with military bearing, her hands clasped behind her back, seemingly immune to the growing tide of doubt surrounding her. Her breathing was slow and controlled, her posture perfect, her dark eyes focused on some distant point that only she could see. But something was shifting in Captain Valdez's understanding. He began to notice details that the others were missing. The way Phantom's uniform fit like it had been lived in rather than just worn. The subtle calluses on her hands that spoke of countless hours gripping aircraft controls. The small scar above her left eyebrow that could only have come from flying with a cracked helmet visor. Most tellingly, her silence wasn't the silence of someone who had nothing to say. It was the silence of someone who had seen enough to know that words were often meaningless. The tactical displays continued to pulse with satellite imagery of the target compound, reminding everyone that while they debated, time was slipping away like sand through an hourglass. Senior Chief Petty Officer Tom "Granite" Williams, a man whose massive frame had earned him his nickname during Bud's training 15 years earlier, stood up with obvious reluctance. His voice carried the authority of someone who had led men through impossible situations and brought them home alive. "Captain Valdez, sir, I've got to express my concerns here. This mission has zero margin for error. We need someone behind those controls who's been tested in the crucible, someone whose reputation precedes them." He gestured toward Phantom with the kind of apologetic politeness reserved for delivering bad news to superiors. "I'm sure Captain Castellanos is a fine pilot, but fine isn't good enough for this operation." The room erupted in a chorus of agreement. Voices overlapped as the SEALs shared their experiences with pilots who had cracked under pressure, missions that had gone sideways because someone in a critical position couldn't handle the heat. They spoke of friends lost to pilot error, of extractions that had turned into disasters because aircraft crews weren't adequately prepared for combat conditions. "Sir, we need someone like Voodoo Patterson," Morrison said, referring to a legendary Army aviator whose exploits had become the stuff of special operations folklore. "Someone who's flown through hell and came out the other side with stories to tell. Someone who's got the kind of reputation that makes enemy pilots think twice before engaging." The mention of Patterson's call sign triggered a flood of war stories. The SEALs began recounting missions with pilots who had earned their respect through spectacular displays of skill and courage. They talked about aviators who had landed helicopters on postage stamp-sized landing zones while under heavy fire, who had flown damaged aircraft hundreds of miles to safety, who had risked their own lives to save wounded soldiers. Through it all, Phantom remained motionless in her corner of the room. The contrast was striking. 23 of the Navy's most elite warriors engaged in animated discussion, while she stood in perfect stillness, like the eye of a hurricane. Her silence was becoming more noticeable with each passing moment, creating an almost gravitational pull that began to draw attention despite the ongoing debate. Valdez found himself studying her more intently. There was something about her presence that reminded him of the most dangerous operators he'd known, men who never needed to announce their lethality because it radiated from them like heat from a forge. The quietest ones, he'd learned over 2 decades of special operations, were often the most dangerous. The mission parameters remained unchanged. 18 hours to extract a CIA asset from a heavily defended compound, navigate through contested airspace, and return home before enemy forces could organize a response. The clock was ticking, and they still needed a pilot. Mackenzie, emboldened by the support of his teammates, decided to press the point further. "Ma'am, I think what we're all trying to say is that this isn't personal. It's about capability and proven performance under extreme stress." His young face carried the earnestness of someone who genuinely believed he was helping. "Maybe you could tell us about some of your combat experience. Help us understand what qualifies you for this kind of mission." The request seemed reasonable enough, but it landed in the room like a challenge thrown at the feet of a gunfighter. Every eye turned toward Phantom, waiting for her response. Would she defend herself? Would she list her accomplishments? Would she try to prove her worthiness to men who had already decided she wasn't qualified? For the first time since standing up, Phantom moved. It was barely perceptible, a slight shift of her weight from one foot to the other. But in that tiny movement, something changed. The quality of her silence evolved from passive to active, from uncertain to predatory. When she spoke, her voice was as calm and level as still water, but it carried undertones that made hardened warriors unconsciously lean forward. "Gentlemen," she said, the single word falling into the room like a stone dropped into a deep well. The conversation stopped instantly. The room fell so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning became audible, creating a subtle soundtrack for whatever was about to unfold. Captain Valdez felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. After 20 years of leading special operations, he had developed an instinct for recognizing dangerous moments, those crystalline instances when everything balanced on the edge of a knife. This was one of those moments. Phantom took a single step forward, moving with the fluid precision of someone who had learned to control every aspect of their body. Her dark eyes swept the room, making brief contact with each skeptical face. When she spoke again, her voice carried the quiet authority of absolute confidence. "You want to know about combat experience?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement that somehow managed to contain both acknowledgement and dismissal of their concerns. The way she said it made several of the SEALs shift uncomfortably in their chairs. There was something in her tone that suggested they had stepped into waters deeper than they realized. She paused, letting the silence build pressure like water behind a dam. When she continued, her words came slowly, deliberately, each one placed with surgical precision. 3 years ago, Operation Gothic Serpent, Mogadishu. Ring any bells? The effect was immediate and electric. Morrison's smug expression evaporated like morning mist. Williams's massive frame went rigid. Mackenzie's young face paled as recognition dawned. Operation Gothic Serpent hadn't been a standard mission. It had been a classified rescue operation that had gone catastrophically wrong, the kind of disaster that created legends and nightmares in equal measure. Valdez felt his pulse quicken. He remembered the after-action reports from Gothic Serpent, the whispered stories that had circulated through special operations communities like Ghost Tailies. A pilot had saved an entire team that night, flying a damaged aircraft through a storm of enemy fire that should have been unsurvivable. The pilot's identity had been classified, but the call sign had become legendary: Phantom. The pieces began falling into place like tumblers in a lock clicking open. The quiet confidence, the ribbons on her uniform, the way she carried herself with the relaxed alertness of a true predator. She wasn't just any pilot. She was the pilot, the one whose exploits had become the stuff of late-night conversations in bars frequented by special operations personnel. Rodriguez, the sniper who had been so dismissive moments earlier, now stared at Phantom with the wide-eyed expression of someone who had just realized they were standing in the presence of a living legend. His voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Your Phantom, the Phantom." The room had transformed from skeptical to stunned in the space of a heartbeat. These hard-bitten warriors, men who prided themselves on their knowledge of special operations history, suddenly realized they had been questioning the qualifications of someone whose name was already written in the annals of military aviation history. But Phantom wasn't finished. She took another step forward, and her next words carried the weight of someone who had stared death in the face and refused to blink. "I flew a shot-up MH-60M through a Category 3 sandstorm with hydraulic failure, avionics down, and 17 special operations personnel on board." Her voice remained perfectly level, but each word hit the room like a physical blow. "Surface-to-air missiles locked onto my 6 enemy fighters closing from multiple vectors, and fuel leaking from punctured tanks. The landing zone was a rooftop smaller than this briefing room, surrounded by buildings full of hostiles with RPGs and heavy machine guns. The silence in the room was now absolute. Even the air conditioning seemed to have stopped humming. Every man present found himself holding his breath, afraid that any sound might break the spell of her words. "I put that bird down with 2 inches to spare on each side of the rotors," she continued, her dark eyes reflecting memories of that night 3 years ago when everything had gone wrong, and she had been the only thing standing between 17 elite soldiers and certain death. Took off under fire with a full load, climbed through a wall of tracers, and flew 300 nautical miles on fumes and prayers. Everyone came home. The transformation in the room was complete. Men who had been questioning her qualifications moments earlier now stared at her with something approaching reverence. This wasn't just any combat pilot. This was the pilot whose actions had saved an entire team when everything else had failed. Morrison, who had been so vocal in his skepticism, now looked like he wanted to crawl under his chair. The young SEAL who had questioned whether she had ever been shot at was now faced with the reality that he was looking at someone who had flown through more enemy fire in a single night than most pilots would see in an entire career. Williams, the massive senior chief whose concerns about pilot reliability had seemed so reasonable minutes earlier, slowly shook his head in amazement. "Gothic Serpent," he muttered, his voice filled with newfound respect. "I heard about that mission. They said the pilot who flew that extraction was either crazy or superhuman." Phantom's lips curved in the barest hint of a smile, the first expression she had shown since standing up. "Little bit of both," she said quietly. Captain Valdez stepped forward, his own expression transformed from curious to determined. He had found his pilot. The tactical displays still showed the enemy compound where their CIA asset waited for rescue. The mission clock continued its countdown. But now, for the first time since the briefing began, success seemed not just possible but probable. "Phantom," Valdez said, using her call sign with the respect it deserved, "can you get my team through those SAM sites and into that compound?" She didn't hesitate. "Yes, sir." "Can you get them out again when things go sideways?" Again, no hesitation. "Yes, sir." Valdez nodded once sharply. "Then gear up. We launch in 4 hours." As the SEALs began filing out of the briefing room, their previous skepticism replaced by anticipation and confidence, several stopped to offer respectful nods to Phantom. Morrison, to his credit, approached her directly. "Ma'am," he said, his earlier condescension replaced by genuine respect, "I apologize for doubting your capabilities. It would be an honor to fly with you." Phantom accepted his apology with quiet grace. "No offense taken, Lieutenant Commander. You were looking out for your team. That's what good operators do." The room emptied except for Valdez and Phantom. The captain studied the woman who would be flying his men into harm's way, seeing her now with completely different eyes. The quiet confidence that had seemed like uncertainty was revealed to be the calm assurance of someone who had already proven herself in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. "Phantom," he said quietly, "I have to ask, why didn't you say something earlier? Why let them question your qualifications when you could have ended the discussion immediately?" She was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes focused on the tactical display showing their target. When she finally spoke, her words carried the wisdom of someone who had learned hard lessons about leadership and respect. "Captain, anyone can tell war stories. Anyone can list their accomplishments and demand respect based on past performance." She turned to face him, and he saw something in her eyes that reminded him of the most effective leaders he had known, a combination of humility and unshakable confidence that couldn't be faked or taught. But respect that's demanded isn't respect at all. It's just compliance. The respect that matters, the kind that keeps teams alive, that has to be earned fresh every time. Valdez nodded slowly, understanding flooding through him. She hadn't been uncertain or defensive. She had been patient, waiting for the right moment to reveal her capabilities. It was a level of emotional intelligence and tactical awareness that marked truly exceptional leaders. Besides, she added with that same barely perceptible smile, they needed to voice their concerns. Better to get the doubts out in the open now than have them wondering about my capabilities when the shooting starts. As they prepared to leave the briefing room, Valdez realized that he hadn't just found a qualified pilot for his mission. He had found someone whose leadership style and combat experience might well be the difference between success and catastrophe. 4 hours later, as the sun disappeared behind the Pacific horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, the mission team assembled on the flight line at Naval Air Station North Island. The MH-60M Black Hawk that would carry them into enemy territory sat like a mechanical predator in the pool of harsh floodlights, its rotor blades drooping slightly in the evening air. Phantom moved around the aircraft with practiced efficiency, conducting her pre-flight inspection with the kind of methodical thoroughness that spoke of thousands of hours behind the controls. She checked every system, every connection, every potential failure point, with the focused attention of someone who knew that mechanical reliability was often the difference between life and death in combat aviation. The SEALs watched her work, their earlier skepticism now completely replaced by professional curiosity. They observed the way she moved around the aircraft. No wasted motion, no hurried movements, just smooth, economical efficiency that spoke of absolute familiarity with every aspect of the machine. Rodriguez, the sniper who had been so dismissive in the briefing room, found himself studying her inspection routine with the eye of someone who appreciated professional competence. "She checks everything twice," he murmured to Williams, who was loading his gear into the cargo compartment. "Good," Williams replied, hefting his massive frame into the aircraft with surprising grace. "I like pilots who are paranoid about maintenance. Keeps us alive." As the team settled into their positions, Phantom took her place in the pilot's seat with the fluid motion of someone returning home. Her hands moved across the controls with practiced familiarity, bringing systems online in a sequence that had been burned into her muscle memory through years of training and combat operations. "Com check," her voice came through their headsets, calm and professional. Each team member confirmed their communications were clear, their voices creating a familiar litany that signaled the beginning of another mission. Morrison, now occupying the co-pilot seat, watched Phantom's pre-flight procedures with newfound appreciation. Everything she did spoke of experience and competence. The way she adjusted her seat and mirrors, the methodical manner in which she brought the aircraft's systems online, the quiet confidence with which she handled the machine. "Control, this is Phantom, requesting departure clearance for Operation Night Harvest," she transmitted to the tower, her voice carrying the kind of professional calm that inspired confidence in everyone listening. The response crackled through their headsets. "Phantom, you are cleared for departure. Winds are calm, visibility unlimited. Good hunting." The Black Hawk's engine spun up with a rising whine that built to a steady roar. The aircraft lifted off with smooth precision, climbing into the star-filled darkness above the Pacific. Below them, the lights of San Diego spread like a glittering carpet, slowly fading as they turned east toward their objective. As they flew through the night, heading toward enemy territory and an uncertain fate, the men who had questioned Phantom's qualifications just hours earlier found themselves relaxing in their seats. Her flying was so smooth, so controlled, that the aircraft felt more like a luxury transport than a military helicopter heading into combat. But lurking in the darkness ahead were surface-to-air missiles, enemy fighters, and 1,000 ways for the mission to go catastrophically wrong. The real test of Phantom's capabilities was still to come. The digital displays in the cockpit showed their progress across the vast expanse of ocean. each mile bringing them closer to a confrontation that would either prove Phantom's legendary status or add her name to the long list of pilots who had attempted impossible missions and never returned. In the cargo compartment, 23 of the Navy's most elite warriors settled in for the long flight, their weapons checked, their minds focused on the mission ahead. For the first time since the briefing began, they felt confident in their pilot's ability to get them to their objective and bring them home. They had no idea that the night ahead would test Phantom's skills beyond anything she had ever experienced, pushing her to limits that would redefine what was possible in military aviation. The mission that had seemed straightforward in the briefing room was about to become a nightmare that would require every ounce of her experience, skill, and courage to survive. But that test was still hours away. For now, they flew through peaceful skies, carried by the steady hands of a pilot whose legend was about to grow even larger. 2 hours into the flight, as they approached the edge of hostile airspace, Phantom's voice came through their headsets with the same calm professionalism that had marked her entire performance so far. "Gentlemen, we're approaching the point of no return. From here on out, we're in Indian country. Keep your eyes open and your heads up. We're about to find out what we're all made of." The mission was about to begin in earnest, and somewhere in the darkness ahead, their CIA asset was counting on them to perform a miracle. As they crossed into enemy territory, the first surface-to-air missile sites appeared on their threat warning displays, painting the night sky with electronic signatures of death. Phantom adjusted their flight path with the smooth precision of someone who had danced this deadly ballet before, threading the Black Hawk between overlapping fields of fire with moves that seemed almost supernatural. The real mission was just beginning, and in the hours ahead, 23 elite warriors would discover why Phantom had earned her legendary reputation. They would witness flying that defied belief, decision-making under pressure that bordered on prescient, and courage that would redefine their understanding of what was possible when everything was on the line. But first, they had to survive the gauntlet of enemy defenses that stood between them and their objective. In the darkness ahead, missile batteries tracked their approach, enemy fighters scrambled to intercept, and 100 different ways to die waited in the shadows. The legend of Phantom was about to be tested once again, and this time, 23 of the Navy's best were along for the ride. The night sky stretched endlessly above them, filled with stars that had witnessed countless acts of courage and sacrifice. Soon, those same stars would bear witness to another chapter in the ongoing story of warriors who risked everything for their brothers, their mission, and their country. The Black Hawk flew on through the darkness, carrying its precious cargo toward a destination where legends were made and heroes were born. Behind them lay safety and certainty. Ahead lay the unknown, the dangerous, and the impossible. Phantom's hands remained steady on the controls, her dark eyes focused on the path ahead, her mind already calculating the 1,000 variables that would determine whether they all lived to see another dawn. The mission had truly begun. The threat warning system's electronic chirping filled the cockpit as they penetrated deeper into hostile airspace. Surface-to-air missile sites painted them with search radars, their electronic fingers probing the night sky for targets. Phantom's hands moved across the controls with fluid precision, adjusting their altitude and heading to avoid the most dangerous threat rings while maintaining course toward their objective. "SAM site bearing 270, 8 miles," Morrison reported from the co-pilot seat, his voice tight with concentration as he monitored the electronic warfare displays. The transformation in his attitude toward Phantom was complete. Where hours ago he had questioned her qualifications, he now trusted his life to her skills without reservation. "I see it," Phantom replied calmly, her voice as steady as if she were commenting on the weather. She banked the Black Hawk into a gentle turn, using a ridge line to mask their approach from the missile site's radar. The aircraft responded to her touch like a living thing, every movement precise and economical. In the cargo compartment, the SEALs felt the aircraft's movements and understood they were in the hands of a master. The way Phantom flew wasn't showy or aggressive. It was surgical in its precision, each maneuver calculated to minimize risk while maintaining their timeline. Williams, the massive senior chief who had questioned her capabilities in the briefing room, found himself impressed despite his natural skepticism. "She's good," he murmured to Rodriguez, who was checking his sniper rifle for the third time. "Real good." Rodriguez nodded, his earlier doubts completely evaporated. "Look how smooth she is. No wasted movement, no dramatic maneuvers. She's flying like she's done this 1,000 times." The truth was, Phantom had done this dozens of times, but never under quite these circumstances. Each mission presented unique challenges, and tonight's extraction was particularly demanding. The target compound was located in a valley surrounded by overlapping SAM sites, with enemy airbases close enough to scramble interceptors within minutes of their detection. Success would require threading a needle while blindfolded, and doing it fast enough to be gone before the enemy could respond effectively. "Threat warning," Morrison announced as a new contact appeared on their displays. "Search radar, bearing 090, looks like a mobile SAM unit. They're scanning our vector." Without hesitation, Phantom dropped the Black Hawk into a steep descent, using terrain masking to break the radar lock. The aircraft plunged toward the ground like a falling stone, pulling out of the dive just 50 feet above the desert floor. G-forces pressed everyone into their seats as she leveled out, skimming the landscape at a height that would have been suicidal for most pilots. "Contact lost," Morrison reported, his voice carrying newfound respect. "How did you know that ridge would block their radar?" Phantom's answer came without taking her eyes off the terrain rushing past below them. "Studied the topographical maps for 6 hours while you all were gearing up. Every ridge, every valley, every place where we could hide from electronic eyes." She adjusted their heading slightly, following a dry riverbed that would mask their heat signature from infrared detectors. In this business, preparation and luck are the same thing. The SEALs in the back listened to this exchange through their headsets, gaining insight into the mind of someone who approached combat flying as both an art and a science. This wasn't just natural talent. It was the result of obsessive preparation combined with years of experience in the most demanding environments imaginable. 30 minutes to target," Phantom announced, her voice carrying the calm authority that had marked every aspect of her performance. "Time to start thinking about the insertion." Valdez moved forward in the cargo compartment, studying the target compound on his tablet display. The intelligence photos showed a fortified position built into the side of a cliff, with limited approaches and multiple defensive positions. The landing zone was a postage stamp-sized plateau barely large enough for a helicopter, surrounded by steep drops on 3 sides. "Phantom, what do you think about the LZ?" he asked through the intercom. She was quiet for a moment, processing the tactical situation. "It's doable but marginal. We'll have about 2 feet of clearance on the rotors, and the altitude means less lift from the engines. Plus, if we take fire on approach, there's nowhere to go but straight up or straight down." The honest assessment was exactly what Valdez wanted to hear. Too many pilots would have either claimed it was easy or declared it impossible. Phantom's response showed she understood both the risks and her own capabilities. "Can you do it?" he asked directly. "Yes, sir. But I recommend we go in fast and steep, minimize our exposure time over the valley. Once I set down, you'll have about 90 seconds to get your people off before I have to pull power and get us out of the hover. That bird's going to be working hard in the thin air." Valdez smiled grimly. This was exactly the kind of tactical thinking that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. She wasn't just planning to fly the aircraft. She was thinking through the entire mission profile, understanding how her decisions would affect the ground team's operations. "Copy that. 90 seconds on the ground, then we extract to the alternate LZ for pickup." "Roger," Just remember, once we go in, we're committed. There's no aborting halfway through the approach without exposing ourselves to every gun in the valley. As they flew through the darkness, each mile bringing them closer to their objective, the men who had questioned Phantom's qualifications found themselves wondering how they could have been so wrong in their initial assessment. Everything about her performance spoke of experience, competence, and the kind of cool-headed decision-making that kept teams alive in impossible situations. But the real test was still ahead. Landing in the target LZ would require flying skills that pushed the boundaries of what was possible in military aviation. And if the mission went wrong, if they took casualties, if the extraction became a running firefight, they would need a pilot capable of performing miracles. Looking at Phantom's calm demeanor and listening to her professional communications, the SEALs began to believe they had found exactly that kind of pilot. The threat warning system suddenly erupted in urgent beeping. Multiple radar contacts had appeared on their scope, closing fast from the east. Enemy fighters, scrambled from a nearby airbase, were vectoring toward their position. "Contact, contact, contact," Morrison called out, his voice sharp with alarm. "Multiple fast movers inbound, bearing 095, 12 miles and closing. Looks like MiGs." For the first time since takeoff, tension filled the Black Hawk's cabin. Fighter aircraft were every helicopter pilot's nightmare, fast, maneuverable, and armed with weapons that could destroy a helicopter from miles away. Against jets, helicopters had only one advantage: the ability to fly low and hide in ground clutter. Phantom's response was immediate and decisive. She pushed the Black Hawk even lower, until they were literally racing through canyons with their rotor disc clearing the walls by mere feet. The aircraft bucked and jolted in the turbulent air, but her hands remained steady on the controls. "Going dark," she announced, switching off all external lights and non-essential.